Thanks, Vicky. Again, everyone can hear me okay, I'm guessing. Lovely. All right. So yes, as Vicky said, Amelia's had to pull out. So we have Sally Brown and Firdose Moonda tonight, both of whom are covering very contemporary issues in yoga, which I think is really exciting scholarship and really affects the breadth of contemporary yoga scholarship that we're starting to see, or we started to see in the last few years, which is, you know, it's great news in many ways. So we are going to start with Sally, who is a PhD candidate at Leeds Beckett University, and Sally's thesis topic is the academic study of yoga from a kind of health and community studies, or more broadly a sociological perspective. And I'm going to read you her abstract for tonight. Essentially, she's going to be introducing the research that she's in the process of developing for her thesis. So this is unpublished, live as it comes research. So this study explores modern postural yoga in northern UK cities. Specifically, it asks if people identifying as members of a range of minority groups are experiencing barriers to taking part in the mindful movement activity of yoga. This research is in the context of current literature that identifies the majority of yoga participants in the global north as white, female, and university educated. Also, there is evidence that yoga offers a broad range of health and well-being benefits, exclusion from which may represent a form of health inequality. Qualitative methodology is used to surface lived experiences. Study contributors are sourced through yoga teachers working in accessible or community yoga with minority groups in northern UK cities. And for the purposes of this study, and indeed this paper, minorities include people who are from a Black, Asian, or other minority ethnic background, disabled, LGBTQ+, from a disadvantaged community or on a low income, identify as trans or gender neutral, have a larger body type, are aged over 65, or from a religious or cultural community. Individuals identifying as male are also included, as they are a minority in modern postural yoga. Initial findings indicate that study contributors do experience barriers to accessing yoga. And I'm not going to say what they are because Sally's going to introduce them to us. Over to you, Sally.
Hi, I'll just share my screen. Okay, is that okay for everybody? Right, okay, well, thank you, Theo, and thank you, SOAS, for inviting me here to speak today. Well, not here, virtually. Yes, as Theo said, I'm going to be talking about my PhD research study, which is looking at minority experiences of yoga access and participation. And so just briefly, before I go on to talk about my study, I'd like to give you a bit of background about myself and context for the research. So I'm in my second year of my PhD at the Health and Communities Department at Leeds Beckett University in northern UK. So I'm coming to the study of yoga from a social science perspective, and my academic background is in sociology, social anthropology and religious studies, and I have particular interests in population health and well-being, health promotion and health inequalities. I've also got a long-standing interest in health and diversity generally. I worked for many years in journalism and communications in the NHS, covering things like health promotion, older people's health and care, disability rights, and equality, diversity and inclusion. And on a personal level, I have a hidden disability myself. I've received an autism diagnosis about 10 years ago, so I identify as neurodiverse. And as a yoga teacher, I work in community and accessible yoga, teaching minority groups, including older people, autistic people, wheelchair users. So I have been extremely lucky for the last 2 years to teach a community yoga class in a disadvantaged inner city area of a northern English city. And it was through this class that I first started to begin to ask the questions that have gone on to form my PhD thesis topic. So the class is unusual in that it's local authority funded and therefore free. And it's usually held, COVID allowing, in a locally authority allowed building in the middle of this diverse and disadvantaged community. So this community has it's an area of high density short-term let housing, it's high levels of crime and unemployment, and its residents experience poor levels of health and well-being. So the people who attend this class are from a broad range of cultural, class, age and ethnicity background, and many face challenges in relation to things like income, employment, and have also physical and mental health and well-being difficulties. So I think you'll probably all agree that there are a few classes like this, and I began to wonder how easy or difficult that made it for people from minority backgrounds to either try yoga and or carry on doing it. So when I was fortunate enough to be able to start my PhDs, I began with a literature review, to find out if anyone else had looked into this area. And this threw up areas of interest in 3 respects. Firstly, there have been few, if any, previous academic studies looking at minorities and participation in yoga. Those that have, or most studies in this area, they're firstly not from the UK. They come typically from either a medical perspective, looking at yoga's therapeutic effects, or from a sports and fitness industry perspective, investigating things like motivation, etc. The few studies that exist also do tend to focus on one specific type of minority group rather than looking across a broad range of diversity and or intersectionality. The second area that I found very interesting was some very interesting sociological thinking relevant to this question. I found several theoretical frameworks that I intend to use as prisms through which to examine access to yoga as an issue of health equality. So these include the concept of well-being, which is a much more meaningful and broader measurement than health of how well a society is doing by its citizens. The ideas of health inequality and the social determinants of health developed by Sir Michael Marmot and expanded in books including The Spirit Level by Wilkinson and Pickett. And this looks at how unequal access to the activities and resources that promote good physical and mental health in our society, such as yoga, constitutes health inequality, and how there is a sliding scale for that inequality, with the most disadvantaged being the most negatively affected. Another theory I'll be looking at is social capital, as proposed by Pierre Bourdieu. And there are multiple applications to this study from this theory, in particular perhaps the habitus and the field theory, which proposes that the behavioural norms required of group membership can act both as a cement to hold group insiders together, but also to exclude those who are outside. And then finally, I will be looking quite closely at critical race theory and other critical theories, including disability, because these offer a framework for me as a participatory researcher to reflect and record on my own potential bias and influences as both a yoga teacher and as a neurodiverse minority group member, as an insider. The third area from my literature review that was of great interest was some very recent statistics around minority participation in yoga. So my literature review revealed that despite yoga's significant expansion in the UK and global north in recent decades, participation remains limited to a very narrow population group. And these are the statistics that really stand out. They're from a study by Cartwright et al. In 2020, and they show that yoga teachers and students in the UK are 91% white, 87% female, and 71% university educated. And this finding is echoed in a study in America, Ross 2013, it had very similar stats. And I think, many of us might know this instinctively on some levels, but I think you'll agree to see these figures in such stark black and white are very sobering. And what it reveals is that yoga in the global north is effectively a monoculture, and that it is not being accessed by the full range of diverse people in our society. This lack of diversity in yoga is a source of concern on many levels. Firstly, it goes against the values that are at the heart of traditional yoga of respect, kindness, and of ahimsa. It also fails to respond to the challenges being made, quite rightly, currently, to the dominant white elite patriarchy and legacies of colonialism in other arenas in a world that is post-George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, Me Too and COVID. And thirdly, it reveals that the health and well-being benefits of yoga that are being increasingly well documented are not being accessed by the very people who are perhaps most in need of them. So, having done this literature review, my research question, I then refined. It now asks the question, what are people from minority groups experiencing when accessing and participating in yoga, and what factors influence their access and continuation? So, very briefly, just touching on my research design, I employed, or am employing, a qualitative methodology following Braun and Clark's model and suggestions, and this is in order to obtain rich, or what they call thick, data. I'm also placing individuals' lived experience at the centre of my research as a basic principle of inclusion. My method, I am conducting semi-structured one-to-one interviews on Zoom, partly due to the pandemic, and I'm carrying all out those within a 12-month period. But the interviews on Zoom also allow people to speak quite fluently and clearly and share their insights. My study participants, after some analysis and research, I defined minorities in the context of this study as people from groups that are a minority in society and or in yoga. So I think Theo may have read this out, but the study participants come to be people who are from a Black, Asian or other minority ethnic background, disabled, LGBTQ+, trans or non-binary, from a disadvantaged background on a low income, aged over 65 or of a larger body type, or any intersectionality thereof. Just a note that I did not include men, although they are a minority in yoga, their experience in society and perhaps yoga is one of dominance and therefore not in line with other minority groups. However, as several of the study participants are from other minority groups who are also men, I have still been able to capture the male experience. For recruitment, I recruited from all minority groups, and I connected to gateway yoga teachers who work with specific marginalised groups. I also recruited through social media and posters, and some participants were through personal contact. So to date, I've conducted 10 interviews. I'm interviewing students, and I also intend to interview some of these guardian teachers for their gateway teachers for their perspective. For data analysis, I'm employing a thematic approach, with the themes being generated both inductively from the raw data and deductively from theory and prior research. So my emerging findings, obviously my data analysis is an early stage, however, and no overall conclusions can really yet be drawn. However, I can present today some emerging themes, some initial thoughts, and some illustrative participant quotes. So the emerging findings around factors that affect yoga access and participation, these factors can be loosely grouped, or are being loosely grouped, into two major themes and one significant sub-theme. So I'm just getting a bit confused here with my slides. I'll click and see what happens. Right, okay. So the participants, so far that I have processed the data of, there are 7 participants. They represent a good cross-section of minority groups with some intersectionality. And I'm going to kind of leave this list of who these people are as I read the quotes so that you can get a feeling of who they are and what their feelings are. So the first theme, right, the practicalities are the first emerging theme, and these are things that are practical, real-world considerations, including the class cost, the venue type, location, timing of classes, the teacher, and then perceptions. These are factors that exist in the mind or are influenced by how something is looked at or perceived, including what you have to look like, be, or be able to achieve to do yoga, what kind of people do it. And then a sort of a significantly emerging sub-theme within perceptions is the aspect of yoga that are alien or unfamiliar or other, things like its cultural origins, spiritual content, and its lack of presence in the media. So moving into the first set of emerging themes, practicalities. Cost was identified as an influential factor by several participants, with all but the most affluent feeling that current prices are unaffordable, which is a difficult issue given what have been identified as the poor paying conditions experienced by yoga teachers. This is a comment from Christine. She said, for some people, cost is a factor. It is, yes. And when you retire, it's even worse, because not everybody has a good pension, because when you're poor, you're trying to bring a family up, saving for a pension is not a consideration. So for lots of elderly I know in my community and the Black community, that is definitely an issue. Venue location is came out as a significant factor. Participants' strong preferences were for locations to be nearby and in their own community. So a comment here from Jane. I thought the council offered that opportunity specifically for the people living in around there. This is yoga in a disadvantaged area, because they wouldn't have much opportunity. While up here in an affluent area, there are yoga centres, as well as some classes in our primary schools, sports centres, and things like the leisure centre. I can't really think of any leisure centres around there, really. Another emerging theme that was felt to be an influential factor for encouraging participants to continue with yoga with the individual teachers. So a comment here from Claire. Definitely 100%. If I hadn't had the teacher that I had and the experience that I had, I probably wouldn't be doing yoga now. It's that they were really on a physical level, really clear instructions, really gentle yoga. It was non-judgmental. There's no judgment there. So when I wasn't getting it, I felt comfortable and safe to keep going back. Timings of class are an issue around accessibility for some participants. Jane commented, after the pandemic, whenever I try to access the teacher's yoga class, which I think is 5:30, it's a time when I need to feed the children. It's really awkward. It just wouldn't fit at all. Sociability was a contributing factor for some people's feeling how accessible yoga was. So a comment from Tom. I really like to do all of the fun social things. Yoga isn't very social. I mean, they might do it all together in a group, but you don't have a chat and a play. There's no real conversational banter. And this is backed up by a comment from Christine, who said, it would benefit if there was some way of socializing as well. For lots of people, it's a contact that you might not have for the rest of the week. I think to make it more accessible, you'd want a little something to close, a cup of tea and a biscuit for free. So another factor that affects yoga accessibility for these minority groups is online yoga. So there were some series of questions around that threw up some interesting responses. So Anita said, during pandemic, there were online classes, but I just didn't have the space at home to do yoga and stuff. And I just missed having people there instead of an online class. And to be honest, I thought it was expensive and I could just probably find something online for free. And Claire commented, I did a class online in lockdown and I struggled with that. I felt uncomfortable and I can't put my finger on why, other than I couldn't follow it. It was online and it was quite fast paced. There were tons of people, about 100 people in this online class, and I couldn't follow it at all. And it made me feel quite stressed, actually. So moving on to the second emerging theme, which is of perceptions, people's perceptions, and how these affect yoga access and participation. So there was a perception of yoga as being a female activity. So a comment from Jane, she said, people are just generally thinking yoga's for women because it's gentle. Boxing is for male because it's just general ingrained sexism. And Dave commented, some people I think he meant men, maybe think, oh, it's too poncy. Maybe it seems feminine. It is mostly done by women, so I guess they see it as a women thing. Another factor that affects access and participation is a perception of a need for a certain clothing or a certain body type. So Christine commented, you don't get a lot of overweight people doing yoga. When I've seen the yoga classes and the people I know who do it, not many of those are big. I think it's because of getting into those positions. Most people who are big will be thinking, well, I can't get my arm around my stomach, let alone. See what I mean? And then as regards clothing, Jane commented, it wasn't the case in the UK, not that much really, but when I did yoga in a Southeast Asian country, then I just felt like, okay, I need to buy some clothing now just to be fashionable. And I thought, okay, I'm just embarrassing myself. I need to buy outfits to do yoga. There is also a perception of a need for a certain physical skills or ability. So, and this affects people's the accessibility of yoga, participants felt. So Claire commented, I'm not very physically adept, so being in a group scenario when I'm expected to make movements, I was worried, what if I can't make those movements? And then there's also a concept of a perception of yoga of not being competitive. So Tom commented, yoga isn't supposed to be competitive. I'm not competitive per se, but I like to push myself to achieve whatever I can achieve. And then a large sort of area of comment around how accessible yoga was perceived to be was around who does yoga, what kind of person. So Anita said, I went to another class maybe once or twice, and it was lots of these alternative kinds of individuals there. And that made me feel really like, oh, this is very hippie-ish. And Tom commented, really, yoga isn't for everybody, or it's not promoted as for everybody. And Christine said, I think yoga has probably got a bad name. Well, when I say a bad name, I don't mean a bad name. It's just seen as something that people who have a certain consciousness do, people with time on their hands, people with money. And then another section within this, what type of person does yoga, was related to the negative effect on accessibility of not seeing someone like me. So Grace commented, I don't recall seeing any other Black people at the class I went to near me. For me, it didn't matter, but I can understand some people feeling out of their comfort zone. I think the people that go, like me, we know other white professionals that we maybe work with who say, ooh, have you tried yoga? Because my friend that took me was white, it wasn't a Black friend. And Anita too said, there's just a lot of newness. And I think I was the only Asian in the class as well. And everyone was pretty much older than me or middle-aged. And then the sub-theme within perceptions that has quite a strong presence coming through is the number of access factors were identified as reflecting a sense of unfamiliarity and otherness about yoga, which made some participants uncomfortable. So generally the unfamiliarity in your first time, so this is a comment from Grace, she said in your first time it can be off-putting. You think, what's this about? It can seem really alien, but it's like everything, you've got to persevere. And there's a comment from Tom about yoga's origins. It's Middle Eastern or Eastern philosophies. You've got to be more broad-minded in order to take things on which are from that walk of life. The spirituality aspect of yoga was a factor for several people. People took different perspectives on this. Claire said, the fact that it's coming from a spiritual place was really important to me. I think if it had just been a physical yoga class with that spiritual element, that would have impacted on whether I would have had the longevity to keep going. Whereas Grace took a slightly different position. It's like people don't celebrate Halloween because it's seen as pagan, but I didn't think of yoga like that. I just thought, oh, it's exercise and I need to go. And then another factor influencing the accessibility of yoga to minority groups is its sort of lack of media presence and role models. So Jane commented, I actually started to notice about yoga because there is a really famous male yogi in the Southeast Asian country that was when I was quite young. It was more of a quirky show because he was so flexible, but still it got everyone thinking there is something called yoga out there. which we don't really have here in the UK at all. And then, so just in conclusion, that's not quite the right slide. I will be conducting further data collection and analysis and amending my findings accordingly. But hopefully this study will add to the knowledge and fill a gap in current literature, as well as providing insight to help increase diversity and inclusivity in yoga in the UK and global north. So thank you, everybody. And I think it is questions, isn't it, if anybody has any.
Great, Sally, thank you. I was going to ask you could stop sharing your screen. Brilliant. So it always takes a few minutes for the Slido questions to come in. Vicky, can you drop the link back in the chat as well for anyone who's joined us late? That'd be really lovely. But I get to use my host privilege and ask a couple of things myself whilst it's happening, which is nice. So I guess there's two things that really occur to me that you maybe already starting to think about. And the first one is, I mean, I know as much as anyone that with a PhD, you, like with any research project, you have to draw boundaries around the project, and therefore you can only study what you can study. You can't study everything, right? And that's part of the thing I think that's really important for people to know about PhD research. But I guess I'm wondering, when we're talking about particularly the previous studies around who does and doesn't engage with yoga, in my experience, when I'm looking at that data and I'm looking at those studies, it's all about studio culture or specific classes, and that's what's not being measured, perhaps because it's very difficult to measure, is the people who might be doing yoga with Adrienne on YouTube, or might be doing yoga at home because, you know, their mum taught them a bit of yoga or whatever else it might be. So I guess I'm wondering whether there's any way within your data and in your study to be looking at those, what we might call non-institutional or non-formal yoga experiences. Certainly I know, like, a lot of people come to yoga, for example, because they've done a bit of yoga on the Wii Fit. I mean, you know, and I don't think that data is being kind of gathered either. So I just wondered if that's come into your thinking at all so far. That's going on.
Yes, I mean, I did have a chunk in about kind of my study parameters, and I took it out in the interest of time. So I've done several definitions, one of which is I established that participation, and I use the word participation rather than practice, as it has a kind of a broader layman's understanding. For the purposes, this study should mean taking part in a group class in person, or engaging in yoga at home, either alone or with a recorded video or live teacher, at least once, or preferably more. So that's my definition of who's done yoga. I mean, perhaps I could also tell you that I decided the study should also focus on regional UK cities, as these historically have significant high degrees of disadvantage and diversity, and a significantly different experience to in London. And then I also decided that any style of yoga is included in the study, and this is based on the literature review, which identifies a consensus definition of yoga as comprising movement, breathwork, mindfulness, and meditative practices. And as these elements are present in different degrees in all current studies, styles or schools of modern yoga, they're all included in the study. So I hope that's answered your question.
And those parameters are great. What I just want to point out is the studies you evidence, that the studies you include that talk about demographics with regards to participation in yoga that already exist. I'm not sure that their parameters are that broad. That's what I'm saying. So it's whether it's always a problem, I think, in research when we're looking at literature reviews for yoga, is like, are we comparing like with like? Because your definition and your parameters make perfect sense to me, but there are, in the existing literature, that's not always the case. The
existing literature as regards, you mean general participation in yoga, or minority participation? I mean, the Cartwright study did employ a cross-sectional online anonymous survey that was distributed through UK-based yoga organisation studios and events. So possibly that should exclude that way. There was a previous study by Ding and Stamakatis in 2014, which also found that people were more likely to be older, female, degree educated, and non-manual social class, and I don't know the provenance of that one. Likewise with the American study, Kramer et al. 2016, they found yoga participation. So participation, I'm not sure, I would have to look into that, with young, middle-aged, healthy, university educated women.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting that you know, that to draw out those, how those parameters have been drawn in previous studies as well, because if we're looking at studio culture, that already cuts out a large amount of yoga that's actually happening, I think. So I just think that's interesting with regards to the literature review specifically. And I guess the other question I have, and I know we have questions coming in, which is lovely. My other question is around, I know it's very early in your analysis to start talking about this, but with regards to a number of your findings, it may be said that a number of those aspects are maybe difficult for individual yoga teachers to actually do anything about, and I find with accessibility this is often an issue. So when it comes, for example, to people's perceptions of yoga, they may be based on media representations of yoga that then individual yoga teachers can't do anything about. Or if we're talking about the provision of leisure centers, for example, in particular areas, and again, I guess it's that interesting balance between which of these factors are structural and which of these factors can individual yoga teachers do something around. And I just wonder how your analysis is starting to figure those things out.
Just to follow up on your previous question, I think that there are studies coming through around specifically online yoga, because of the pandemic. I've seen people working on several. That's not necessarily what I'm doing. I'm doing kind of access to yoga through whatever purposes. So I think we stay tuned. I think there will be lots coming through. That's been fun. And in terms of this study, and the study isn't actually looking at solutions. It's not meant to be trying to draw in it. That's why I said about there were quite a lot of studies coming from a sports perspective, where they very much are looking at saying, so how can we get more people into yoga? And they're looking at being promotion activity, etc. This is very much a kind of a from a lived experience perspective, and looking at people's perceptions and understandings of what's happened to them, and it'll then be used as a source material for people to, I guess, put forward proposals for how to address it.
Yeah, nice. Okay, now that makes perfect sense to me. It's just nice to know those parameters. Okay, great. So we have a fair number of questions coming in, which is lovely. And some of them are whether anonymous. Obviously, I'll read them out, and if we can go to people, we'll go to people. The first one is anonymous, and it's a great question, which I'm sure you've thought about, around researcher positionality, which is, how do you think your identity as a white university educated female impacted your research? And I want to point out that you started with a positionality statement of talking about things like your education, but also your hidden disability as well. So I'm sure this is a question you have thought about as well.
Yes, it is. I mean, it's obviously it's the kind of the elephant in the room, isn't it, really? The irony of me doing this study. And as I have employed various self-reflexive techniques that have been advised to me by my supervisors, and that is where the critical race theory and critical disability theory come in. Involves having an ongoing self-reflexive study diary, and I will be delving further into the processes of critical race theory, etc., which do specify how one conducts a non-biased piece of research. So yeah.
Thank you for that answer, because I find that like non-specialists, particularly people who haven't done anthropological and social sciences research, think that this question comes up a lot, and I think that people don't realize quite how much attention is paid to this. I have entire manuals on the insider outsider problem one of the biggest most famous books within religious studies, for example, is The Insider Outsider Problem in the Study of Religion. It's we can literally rattle off the title. It's so important. So it is something that we think about a lot, and it's worth kind of reassuring people on that. The second question we have is, are you also looking particularly at religious backgrounds, and whether there's a difference there? They're asking between migrants or more recent migrants as well, or communities that might be more secularized, second or third generation.
That is a good question, actually, and I have just realized that my definition of my study participants did at one point include and from particular religious or cultural backgrounds, so possibly that has dropped off my definition, so I'll just put that back on. But there was also an extra piece of information in my presentation I took out due to time, saying that as yet, I've not had any participants talking around the issues of cultural appropriation and some of the other issues that arise from that kind of thing. But I haven't had a participant from the same religious or cultural background as yoga as yet. So that is something that I need to consider in my sampling framework, and it is definitely on my radar to find out.
Great.
I'm not sure why, particularly for migrants. Sorry, have I answered that question?
Yes, you have.
If anyone wants to do a follow-up one, yeah.
Okay, so we're still. I'm not going to get to all of these for the moment, but I do want to come to Helen, who luckily is right here, so I can ask Helen to unmute herself. Can you ask her question directly?
Hello, thank you very much, Thea. Hi, Sally.
Hi.
I was wondering whether, sorry, I'll put my video on. It's a bit nice.
You look great. A plate of croissants.
No, yeah, keep the croissants.
I was wondering if you had any comments from your participants about whether it mattered to them or not that teachers also don't represent the minorities.
I did. It was a piece of data I was actually looking at earlier today, and I haven't had time to fully process it, but it was from Christine, the participant who's Black, Afro-Caribbean, British with sight impairment, etc. And she went into quite long detail about this because I asked that question, and her analysis was extremely interesting because she was talking about the fact that people from her community and presumably other ethnic minorities or minority groups have got used to it, and they actually look aside of it because it's so much the case that they wouldn't go to anything otherwise. But she was very aware of the sort of socio-political reasons for that, and she was talking very eloquently about how if you do see a member of an ethnic minority teaching in a teaching position in anything, you're fully aware of how many hurdles they've had to jump over to get to it. So it's a strange kind of double think, I think, having to go on in people's minds, and that people standing up in front of classes very often are from the dominant culture, and how people from the minorities just have to kind of deal with that. Although, as I think I touched on at some point, that's what's beginning to be asked of all sorts of activities, isn't it? Why should that be? Whether that's representation of minority on television, in acting, or anything else. So I think that's something to tease out.
Yeah, and that in itself hasn't been a barrier to your participants because, like you say, there's not really a choice, really.
I think that my next stage of analysis is going to be looking at the things that people aren't saying. It sounds really silly, but one wonders if people are saying, yeah, it doesn't matter, but actually there's a subliminal effect. It's the same with the teachers. The teachers I've spoken to have all said, well, I've spoken to some teachers who are from minorities themselves, and they've all gone, no, I had no problem getting into yoga. And you're thinking, really? And whether there's some sort of collective sort of amnesia that goes on when you have become engaged in yoga, that you then forget what happened to you before you did manage to overcome potential barriers. But that's a huge area that I'm going to have to really kind of look into before I start talking about it in public.
Thank you for that question, Helen. I just wanted to point out one of the things I've seen a lot more of in the last few years in teacher training programs, because that's my kind of area of research is mostly around yoga teaching, more specifically, and I'm seeing more and more teacher training programs offering bursaries to kind of traditionally disadvantaged and marginalized groups. And I think it's important to remember how often the barriers are financial. It's that simple, because it costs a lot to have the time and the money to do teacher training of different kinds. And as a result, I think we are seeing those numbers starting to change, but I haven't seen any kind of formal data on that, just, as a kind of anecdotal anthropological kind of insight.
Just apocryphally, one of my participants is a trainee teacher, and she's from a British, Asian, Pakistani background, and she didn't talk about the money. I think she's fairly middle class, but she still lives in a not very well off area. But the issues she was talking about were much more about attitudes and people like me than the money, which was quite interesting.
Yes, but I think the attitudinal plays into it, in that if you have a teacher trainer that's offering bursaries to particular groups, then that also reflects an attitude that says you are welcome here, which is kind of, it's all wound up. All right, I'm going to leave the questions for the moment. They're still coming in. We may get back to them when we come to Firdose, and I think there's an interesting overlap here between your work and Firdose's work anyway, that will make some of these questions relevant. I just want to make sure we have enough time. So thank you for now. Don't go anywhere. And I'm gonna just introduce Firdose for people. So Firdose Moonda is a graduate from our own MA in the traditions of yoga and meditation at SOAS, but is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. Her doctoral research is provisionally entitled Yoga, Politics and Possibilities for Social Justice, as is the title of her paper tonight. And her work is being done through the Anthropology department, and aims to examine yoga through the lens of history, race and class. And I'll just give a little bit of the flavor of the abstract for you. So this research is considering yoga as a political instrument, and whether yoga can actually be used as a tool for promoting social justice. It takes an interdisciplinary approach using historical, anthropological and interventionist methods, and begins with a reflection of yoga's political and social developments in context both in and outside of India, and as a tool for health, before questioning how and whether yoga could be used to address trauma, and culminating in a series of workshops using yoga as a practice of freedom. The work will consider yoga's changing image, interested in and accessibility to yoga, the impact of commercialization and commodification on yoga, and uses of yoga in the cause of social justice. And I'm going to leave it there because I'm sure a lot more is going to be within Firdose's paper itself. So over to you.
Thanks so much. Good evening, everybody. It's really nice to be here from South Africa. And as Theo said, I was one of the graduates of the SOAS Masters. So I'm at a slightly earlier stage of my research process than Sally is, in that I am coming up on completion of the first year, and I'm yet to present my proposal to the ethics board. So tonight I'm just going to go through what I've got so far in terms of the literature and in terms of the questions that I'm asking as I get ready to move on to the next stage of the research. So just to give you a little bit of background, I'm a third generation Indian South African, or South African Indian. We haven't quite decided how we phrase it yet. And I've sort of self-identified as Black up until, I guess, politics in South Africa changed, and then we had to identify as, in my case, generic Black. And I've really grappled with the issues of race and whiteness and fitting in throughout my life. My other real job is as a cricket writer, so I'm very much involved in empire and colonization and patriarchy, and that has kind of spilled over into my research here. I've actually added a little, since presenting to Theo, a little kind of subclause to my thinking of what my dissertation title will be, which is that I'll be examining radical yoga practices in response to caste. And I'm using caste in the way that Isabel Wilkerson understands it in her book Caste. And I settled on this after going through, I was first saying in response to discrimination and then in response to whiteness. But I've decided to settle on caste because, as you'll see from this definition, where she describes it as a system of artificial construction, a fixed and embedded ranking of human value that sets the presumed supremacy of one group against the presumed inferiority of other groups on the basis of ancestry and immutable traits that would be neutral in the abstract, but are ascribed life or death meaning in a hierarchy favoring the dominant caste, using rigid, arbitrary boundaries to keep the ranked groupings apart. When I read the book and looked at especially Wilkerson's 8 pillars of caste, which deal with things like pollution, how caste is passed on through hereditary means, and all the kinds of things that really, to me, speak to racial discrimination as well, it seemed to make sense. And in her book, she talks about castes being an Indian social construct, and then also looks at it in the US in terms of settler colonialism versus indigenous people, and then slavery later on, and then also as Nazi Germany. She only really mentions South Africa quite peripherally here. But of course, you would know we have a long apartheid past, and we're very young as a democracy, and these types of hangovers exist here today. So I've settled on caste, and I don't know if that will change again, but to me at the moment, in terms of what I'm looking at, it seems to make sense. The literature that I'm considering, and I haven't done a full literature review yet because I'm still at a bit of an early stage, is kind of along these lines, in that it's going from looking at yoga as a commodity and looking at the work of Andrea Jain, and considering how modern yoga, as Andrea Jain calls it, despite maybe being a little bit different to the tenets of yoga in India or yoga over time in India, still has a lot of meaning and a lot of sacredness for contemporary practitioners. And as Sally mentioned, you know, the studies that we have, especially in the global north, are that contemporary practitioners are women, are mostly white, and are quite wealthy. The same applies in a lot of the global south, but we don't have a lot of, we don't have any data showing that. I mean, I'm just going on anecdotal evidence from cities in the global south. So taking that as a starting point, and then moving on to like a work of Sheena Sood, who talks about the violence of yoga perpetuated by cultural appropriation, and that kind of bypassing of the understanding of human interconnectedness. And then building on that and looking at the impact of settler colonialism, which someone like Chiablu Wakpa looks at, particularly in an American context, but we can also look at it in terms of any colonized country, and especially ones in sub-Saharan Africa, like South Africa or Zimbabwe or Zambia. Both of those works appear in the Race and Yoga Journal, which I found to be one of the few academic publications that look at the intersectionality of yoga and race, and I'm hoping to be able to contribute in that department. And then I've also looked at the work of Shamim Black, who looks at yoga as both the cause and the cure for sexual violence, and she's written about yoga in the Me Too movement and yoga and feminism, and very much a similar thing in that yoga, in terms of both the cause and the cure for racial discrimination, is something that I'm considering, along with the other literature which speaks about yoga's effectiveness as a complementary treatment for a variety of physical and mental health conditions, including anxiety, PTSD, depression, and that sort of thing. And so in my master's dissertation, which looked at teaching yoga in refugee projects in London from a race and class perspective, I used critical race theory there to look at whether the relationship between teachers and students based on the race and class differences between them impacted on the efficacy of the yoga. And that is one of the questions that I'm taking forward into this doctoral research, in that although we know from the literature that yoga does have a role to play in helping people with physical and mental health conditions, will it also then have that role in terms of race-related trauma or caste-related trauma? And that's one of the questions that I'm looking at the moment. So my early exploration has taken me to the decision that I will start by exploring the historical patterns between yoga and politics. And I'm looking at work from things like the social roots of the Bhagavad Gita, which speak about the text as a means of social control. Very peripherally, things like Nath Yogi's encounters with Islam, because I've found some literature on the Mughal emperors being interested in yogis for political reasons. And as somebody of a Muslim background myself, that's an area of interest to me. And then coming to yoga and Indian independence, things like Gandhi and Aurobindo Ghosh, and how they used texts like the Bhagavad Gita to inspire the decolonial movement. And then of course, the contemporary intersection of yoga and Hindu nationalism, which also acts as an exclusionary tool in some ways. So I'm going to start with a historical overview of yoga and politics, which hasn't been done in this form before from what I found. And then also look at uses of yoga for political reasons outside of India. And there are quite a lot of anecdotal bits and bobs about the civil rights movement, figures like Erica Huggins, and then of course coming to the very contemporary Black Lives Matter movement, and also the response to the pandemic, which has caused a lot of trauma, and trauma unequally across race and class lines. And so my two questions are, what is the relationship between yoga and caste in this broader sense that I'm talking about? And then does the embodied experience of yoga empower individuals to act in response to oppression, specifically racial discrimination? So the methodology is what I'm going to, in terms of, it's quite interventionist in its nature. And so therefore the reading and the theories that I'm going through also speak to that kind of almost activism. So this is a very new area for me because my undergraduate degree is not in anthropology. So I've just started looking at the anthropology of the body and embodiment. And I'm trying very hard to look at writers from the global South, people of color, so what you might think of in the global North as marginalized voices, in order to bring out this particular anthropology of the body from a Black and brown perspective. So Frantz Fanon is very influential in the work I'm doing. His work, The Lived Experience of the Black Man, and then also his work on decolonial theory like The Wretched of the Earth and kind of self-actualization for Blackness in the same way as the Black consciousness movement. I'm also looking at Bibi Bakara Yusuf's The Economy of Violence and Mark Singleton's text, Yoga Body, and trying to really have a conversation between a yoga body as a body that does yoga irrespective of what the body is, and it's more about the yoga, and then the racialized body or the genderized body in the cases of these other writings. I'm looking at Black consciousness as well, particularly from an African perspective, because it was such an influential movement here. And Steve Biko's ideas of self-actualization come into that. Audre Lorde, who looks at self-care as an act of political warfare, and the idea of the Black person using whatever means, be it yoga or something else, to reinvigorate themselves for the activist fight. And then also some health humanities. So the department that I'm working with also falls under health humanities, and talking about the importance of well-being in the global context and in the context of a community rather than individualized well-being. And Paul Farmer's work on reimagining global health is something that I've been thinking about there. And then the methodology I'm planning on is very dependent on the pandemic situation. And as you would know, in South Africa, we are facing a third wave and also quite behind in our vaccine rollout. So it will really impact, I think, what I'm able to do. But it will be qualitative research. And my starting point is going to be interviewing teachers who are already doing work on yoga and race in the US and in South Africa. So we have a small section in existence at the moment. It'll include people like Diane Bondi, Kelly Schutt, and the Radical Darshan teacher training that runs in the UK at the moment. And then I'm going to use that information along with the historical information and the theoretical information to design a series of workshops, which I think will have to run online. And so, as I'll talk about in a moment's time, that will obviously limit the sample size. It will give me a particular category of participant, and I'm aware that that could be a cause for reflection at some point. I'm going to roll out workshops, so my work as a teacher trainer is also going to come into play here, in that these workshops will be designed to promote practices of freedom, as I've called them, or self-care practices, but then also teaching practices so that people can teach in their own communities. And in the workshop rollout, which will form part of my data analysis, I'll hope to conduct ethnographic study and participant observation, but I'm also quite keen on a decolonized way of telling the story. And so looking at things like storytelling, journaling, even orally transmitted data, I think could be quite important. And this is something that I'll start thinking about in hopefully the next couple of months. But for our purposes this evening and for what I'm presenting to you, I've thought of a few kind of speculations or questions that I'm still working with and grappling with. And the one which comes in is the historical versus contemporary understandings of yoga origins and purpose, specifically in the global South. So in South Africa, for example, we don't have even a comprehensive history of yoga, which we can turn to. You could Google it and you'll find that the Shivananda Ashram was the first yoga center here in 46, which cannot be because we had indentured labor from India here from the 1860s, but no archival records that have been found yet, and we haven't had access to the archives for 18 months. So just in terms of trying to understand the yoga transmission story into Africa is one thing that I would like to find out more about, but which could prove difficult given access. And then also the cultural associations of marginalized cultures as a whole. Although, you know, there is a group of marginalized people in the global south, and there would mostly be, I guess, people of color, if we were to use that term, there are many differences and schisms in that as well. And I think I would need to be quite careful in terms of when we're talking about yoga as a response to caste is stratified. And so, you know, there's a kind of assumption about the Kenyan sandwich where you had white people at the top, the Indian migrants at the bottom, and then the locals, the Indian migrants in the middle and the locals at the bottom. And so trying to understand those different stratifications and the responses from those groups, I think is something I'll need to consider. And then a big thing for me, as I mentioned, is conducting the research online. Africa is a continent with limited access to data. It is also very expensive to have data, which I think would mean that my practitioners, although because of the online nature, I'm hoping that I can attract a slightly more global audience, I would like to have participants from as many global South countries as possible. But I understand that these limitations could mean, you know, it will end up being a certain wealth class of people that I would have to be working with, unless I can find a way around it through data procurement. And also you need other things like space and that kind of thing to participate in a workshop. And of course, you know that online is very different to the in-person experience. And so I think that will also have a significant limitation on the kinds of observations and the kinds of, because the anthropological work is going to be quite sensorial in that you're looking for people's physical responses in as much as also what they are saying to you and what they're journaling or whatever that might be. So that could be limited by the online experience as well. And I guess I'll know more about that as things progress and as we know whether or not things can happen in person. So that's where I am for now. I think that is my time in any event. Those are my details if anybody would like to get in touch with me. And yeah, I think that's question time. Sorry.
Brilliant. Thank you for those. All right, so I'm going to use, as the questions come in, I'm going to use my my privilege again. Firstly, more of a kind of comment. It's something you and I have talked about already. I just want to really pick up on that difference between like the tangled issue around historical accuracy and the ways in which again, kind of the research that's already been done reflects certain priorities, reflects what's available, reflects what is possible to evidence. And so often, I think sometimes our desire for kind of historical accuracy actually cuts a lot of that more lived experience or oral history out. And I wonder if first of all, I wonder if there's, you know, what are your plans methodologically for trying to uncover some of that, if that's possible? That's my first one, and then I have a second.
Yeah, I do. Look, my initial hope was that I would be able to get to the archives in Pietermaritzburg, which is where a lot of the indentured labor documentation is. But in conversation with my supervisor, she said to me, even if I got in there, you know, I would have to find a diary entry from someone who had written, then I came to South Africa and then I did some yoga or something along those lines. And she thinks the chances of that are quite slim. Obviously, we're assuming, but we're also thinking how much time will I have to spend on finding it. Instead, what I'm planning to do is to try and go to families, especially the family, you know, we have lists of people who arrived on the ships and we know how to track those families, and to ask questions around that. I mean, also depending on who's left, because I mean, I think you know why that would be a concern. So we are trying, that is one option for me. And then the other would be, I think, to recognize in the research that unfortunately some of the story is lost. And so, you know, some of it, there is a whole cascade of things that we will just never know because of oral transmission, because of the impact of colonization and indentured labor and so on. So I feel like it's a frustrating answer, but maybe it's just the answer. You know, there's so many untold stories and untold histories, and that's just a consequence of being who we are.
Yeah, completely, definitely. So the other thing I wanted to pick up on is it was actually a really small thing you said in regards of your how you propose to do the project, and that you will be including a certain amount of teaching people to teach within those workshops. And I wondered how much reading you've done around community education theory, because I'm aware, because that was a big part of my master's, I'm aware of how much of that actually is embedded in traditions of the global south, and things like each one teach one within African contexts and things like that. So I just wanted to give you a chance to kind of mention a little bit of that, because I think most people don't realize that there's an entire kind of, theory of pedagogy coming from the global south, basically.
Yeah, I think in that regard, the person that I really look to is Paulo Freire and Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And I use that also in my master's dissertation in terms of looking at this difference between seeing the students as empty vessels who the teacher is filling with knowledge, and then therefore assuming that the students have none of their own background information, to rather seeing it as an exchange. And I think that'll be really important, because there's so many cultural practices in the global south concerned with healing and concerned with embodiment. And I think a lot of the people that I do work with will have their own ideas and their own understandings of how to use the body, and even movements that would be similar, I think, or aspects of the program that will be similar. So I would really like to bring that into the work as well, and especially look at those Latin American thinkers. Boaventura de Sousa Santos also comes to mind, and try and design my workshop from that standpoint.
Yeah, and bell hooks. Don't forget bell hooks, and beloved communities, very important. Definitely. Okay, so let's see what we've got in as questions coming in. It's an interesting question. How do you deal with, or perhaps how are you reflecting on the current research looking as yoga as the opposite for liberatory practice, i.e., the ways in which yoga can be used in the service of neoliberalism and in the service of oppression? Yes, looking at that.
Yeah, this is a very interesting one, because one of the things which I was thinking about was that if we look at yoga in its iterations over time, something that is common in terms of its philosophy is that there's always an aspect or an aim for liberation from something. So whether it's, liberation of the soul from a cycle of rebirth, or liberation of India from colonial rule, or liberation of the Black body from oppression in terms of the civil rights movement, I see a commonality there. But then, yes, I think that the neoliberal side of it, I don't know, that is a kind of an overarching, just individualized, I guess, pursuit of one's own satisfaction, which is a liberation in some ways, I guess, in that it's a liberation from constraint. I can have whatever I want because I can afford it. But I think I would maybe have to have a critique of the neoliberal form of yoga. And I don't know, I'm still grappling with Andrea Jane's idea about, it is sacred to the people who practice it, in that it's something that you said to me, actually, we have to be descriptive and not prescriptive, and can't say to people, no, but that's not the yoga or the yoga, but rather just record what's happening. And so maybe there is a modern branch of yoga that isn't about any kind of liberation, and that is just about self-serving needs, and I suppose that would have to find a place in the research.
Yeah. We have one that is a comment, but I think it's an anonymous comment, and I think it's an interesting one, because for what it brings up. But it's talking about India and skin whitening products as a comment, and I think that it's an interesting question how colorism in particular plays in to particularly South African context. Must be a really interesting question.
Yeah, I actually reflected on it when Sally was talking about her participant from an Asian background who said that she didn't face any barriers to yoga, and that maybe we can be oblivious to the things that maybe have happened to us in my own experience, but in the experience of many South Africans of color, in that I grew up just at the straddle of democracy, and I grew up as a self-identifying Black person in a white neighborhood, because we were part of the protest movement to try to get things to change. And I always talk about us as being the chameleon generation, in that we tried so hard to fit into whiteness and to get as close to whiteness as possible, that not only did we lose a lot of our own cultures, but we shunned it a lot. And then we started to think that we had kind of slipped in like a slipstream into whiteness, until many years later, as you obviously things become more clear to you and time passes, and you realize that I didn't even realize that I was that close to something, but to what Sally was saying, you know, but I am that close to it. So colorism, and not just from that very literal perspective of the color of one's skin, but acting white, if I can put it that way, is a big part of the discussion. And I think that there is a sense that commercial yoga culture has taken that on, and that there's a hippie element to it, and that there's an element of exclusion to other people. But then that kind of discounts the practices going on outside of the studio culture. And I do think that, you know, talking, when I teach on trainings, for example, I always mention things like Krishna being depicted as blue and dark skinned, and everybody's surprised because people don't know that sort of thing. So maybe an awareness aspect needs to be brought in as well, I think, and that's where the Black consciousness will come in, like, you know, in terms of self-actualization.
Yes, lots to be done in terms of, yes, passing privileges of different kinds as well. Yes, so we have a comment, actually, a question for both of you, which you've Firdose, you've slightly talked about already, which is how the pandemic and COVID restrictions have impacted the research. I just want to give you both a moment to kind of talk about that. So as we're with you, Firdose, first,
Yeah, I mean, a lot in that. You know, we are still in a lockdown here in South Africa. We've come out and gone back in several times. We cannot do anything in person at the moment, which has meant, obviously, for the type of participants I'd like to work with, it's going to be very difficult. And as I mentioned to you, online will be challenging in that only certain types of people have access to data. But also, this is maybe not related to the pandemic, although I don't know, maybe there would be some relation to it. We also had the library at our university burned down through a wildfire, so that didn't help. But I don't think that, I mean, it had to do with the pandemic, in that the fire was started by people who were forced to live on the mountain because they'd lost their jobs because of the pandemic. Right. So yeah, it's really, I think it really will affect things. But I also think, just on a positive note, it's really opened things up, in that there is now, people are doing a lot of things online. And I think doing a yoga workshop online wouldn't be as crazy now as it would have been pre-pandemic. So I think it could open me up to participants who I would not otherwise have reached.
Thank you. I think that's the perfect moment to come to Sally, because I think you were starting to say something very similar in terms of the kind of accessibility of online yoga compared to in-person yoga. Well,
actually, I was listening to what Firdose was just saying there. Something that was occurring to me was about the issue of needing to talk about how the people who participate in your study are by perforce at this time, and only the ones that can access technology. But actually, thinking about my study, and maybe there's something in this for you, I was able to go to yoga participants that I personally had a connection with, who were, because this answers somebody else's question about whether all my participants were on a not low income, and they weren't. There was really quite a high percentage of them, because I had the same issues as you do. How do I reach the genuine people who are being excluded, not just the middle classes who can access things online, etc., and who can do interviews on Zoom? But what I actually did with some of these, you know, the genuine participants we're trying to reach, I did it on the phone. They phoned me and I just recorded it. So so actually it was a good halfway house. It didn't exclude a certain subset of society, but you did have to have a connection with them that had been face to face first. So I'm not sorry, that didn't answer your question, Theo, did it?
But thank you, because I'm sure that's a really helpful idea to think about. Different kinds of media is really important. But yes, the question is around how the pandemic and restrictions have impacted the research more generally. I guess you're at a different point as well, aren't you, in data gathering?
I did have to pivot on my topic though, because initially I was focusing, which is something you've also mentioned, Firdose, around community aspects of yoga. I I was very interested in the social benefits of yoga, because that's what I was seeing in terms of disadvantaged communities benefiting from the intervention, if you like, of affordable community-based yoga. And of course, in the pandemic, you know, there is no kind of, you know, there is no community, is there? Well, there is, but it's kind of online and it's a bit weird. So yeah, it has impacted quite a bit, but I was able to change it to something that was not so much face-to-face interactive dependent. So maybe that's something for you to kind of mull over.
It has been tricky, and it's worth kind of reflecting on how tricky it is for researchers in general, and particularly the thing about PhDs is you have a specific budget and a specific time to collect your data in, and you know, I have friends whose entire PhDs are on hold because they can't do, you know, they literally can't do the field work they need to do because they're at the stage where they're at. Whereas if you're in the kind of writing up stage and your data's already in, it's a lot easier. So yeah, it's tricky if you're on these kind of very time limited situations, and who knows how long we'll all be in it. So I'm going to come to where I'm aware of time, and some of the questions coming in I think we've already kind of answered or talked about. So I'm going to go to a slightly different one, which is around how do you hope your research will make a difference? And I think that's rather than talk specifically about kind of how it impacts inclusion and exclusion, which you're both working on in different ways, or liberation in different ways, like what is the impact that you hope your research has? I think it's a great question. And as you're up, Sally, do you want to go first?
You want me to go first?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, wriggling out of it in some ways, as I said, I'm not looking at solutions, and that's not just me kind of backing out of it. I'm kind of presenting the information for people to work on solutions. So I'm hoping that actually my study is going to start people asking those questions and start the ball rolling to look to solutions. And I think the solutions are a combination of both personal reflectiveness from an individual teacher perspective, plus the kind of structural change that you mentioned earlier. Theo.
Yes, and collective change. There is, you know, there are groups collectively working on this in various different places as well. Yes, yeah, they're really important to remember that each piece of research is just one piece of research. We all come together. Firdose, how about you? What do you hoping your research achieves?
I think the intention behind what I wanted to do was always quite interventionist, in that I had this idea right at the beginning of like redesigning a whole yoga teacher training and looking at pedagogy from a completely decolonized perspective. And then I don't know why some things happened and I changed my mind. But what I'm hoping is that the workshops in particular can provide some kind of prototype, if they are successful, for people to then use. And also that if there's a training component to them, that we could get people who are then trained in the techniques of using yoga to hopefully deal with race-based discrimination, but also their own cultural backgrounds, and they can make a new kind of hybrid and go and teach it in relevant communities and have support. You know, there's so many innovative ways we've been teaching in the pandemic. I run a program for refugees here. We've been teaching over WhatsApp voice note. So if people can come up with different ways to self-regulate, find a little bit of peace and deal with a lot of, you know, we're going to have so much trauma post-pandemic here and everywhere, I guess, that if there is a way for people to have a little bit of ease, I really hope that that's the outcome. It sounds very, you know, I feel like one of those contestants on Miss World who always say world peace when they ask the question. But I feel like if we could just get people to have a little bit more peace in their lives, it would be great, because I have seen, especially the last few months, a lot of trauma, which has been, you know, it really does cause me grief.
Yeah.
Can I just add that it always does have to be led by the people who are affected themselves. That's something that came to me from a professional background around, you know, sort of lived experience and led by those people. So again, I can't be telling people how to do it. And there is a lot of work going on in the States with the accessible yoga movement that is coming up from the people themselves. Yeah. And just, sorry, before we I'm taking lots of time, but somebody also asked me about the fact that I'm doing pan minority, and I really think that's important as well, because I think, you know, although the details may be different, the effect is in common, and I think it's really important to have that kind of power to your elbow through joining across different types of diversity. And I think it also stops one type of different minority kind of dominating others, which can happen when you're in that space of oppression. Yeah.
Nice. Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to ask one last slightly meta question, which is because this work, there is, you know, we're very scattered, those of us who are working on these kinds of contemporary issues. Do you have any questions for each other whilst you're here?
Yeah, can we keep in touch?
And that was going to be my question as well, because I was taking notes the whole time, and I'm like, she's so much further than I am. I got to go.
I feel so isolated. You wouldn't believe I am physically isolated, because I actually moved to a cottage in the coast in the far north when this all started, which is lovely. But I haven't had any contact with any peers or anybody else doing a PhD, really. So this is just a wonderful experience. And anybody who wants to connect, please do.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I'm sure there are ways we can do that, and hopefully that's part of what we're doing. That's part of why we're doing this event. Okay, I'm aware of time, and I think like I said, I think we've basically covered most of the questions that are there. So thank you both for two great papers, and also, you know, thanking you and all of the participants for being willing to come and talk about your research, you know, whilst it's still in the process of settling and forming and so on. And I think hopefully our audience has been very understanding of that, you know, you don't have all the answers just yet and you're still figuring it out. And hopefully also we're giving some sense of what it's like to do this kind of work for anybody who's thinking about postgraduate study in yoga studies of different kinds, of what that might look like. And that all fits within our remit. So yes, again, thank you both for two great papers. We have one more panel, which is with Daniela Bevilacqua on Wednesday, has 3 papers which are quite diverse, because her research interests are quite diverse. So that's going to be an interesting panel, and then hopefully everyone will be back for the roundtable on Friday, where we will be thinking about these questions about, you know, how we can support each other, because it is an issue within, you know, if you think there aren't that many of us in yoga studies, and we get very overexcited when we get to hang out, even if it's just online. So how we can help support that more, and what the kind of emerging themes are of yoga research going forwards, and what that dialogue is like between the practitioner community and the scholar community, and the ways in which we all sit somewhere in the middle of that spectrum.